The complaint was pressed into clay, in a climate-controlled vault of the British Museum beneath layers of glass metal regulation and preservation. There rests a baked fragment no larger than a paperback. A tablet, a surface of earth hardened by heat and time. A record. Museum catalog number BM78942. Nearly 4,000 years ago, a reed stylus moved across wet clay and fixed a grievance in place. Not a hymn, not a parable, not an allegory presented as moral comfort. A grievance. The words are unsettling in their simplicity. Humanity has become too loud. Their uproar is too intense. Sleep cannot be achieved. And what follows in the lines after that is what gives the tablet its unusual chill. The text does not move like poetry drifting into metaphor. It moves like procedure. A problem is named. A disturbance is identified. A responsible authority is implied. Then responses are proposed. Not one response, but several. Not rage, but escalation. Disease is sent. It does not solve the complaint. Drought is imposed. Still the complaint remains. Famine follows. Yet the disturbance continues. At last, the assembly convenes, and the final measure is authorized. That is how the tablet reads. Not as wild, divine temper, not as capricious thunder, but as something colder, something more organized, something that sounds less like mythology and more like administration. And that is the first question we have to return to, slowly, carefully, perhaps more than once. What were the Sumerians recording? What did they believe they were preserving? And why did they preserve it with such obsessive attention to sequence, jurisdiction, procedure, and consequence? If you happen to be listening late at night or in a room where everything is finally quiet, you may already feel the strange closeness of that old complaint. The problem, according to the tablet, was not wickedness in the abstract, not rebellion against heaven in the moralized language we inherit from later traditions. The problem was disturbance, uproar, tumult, noise so constant that rest became impossible. The vault where BM78942 rests remains steady in temperature. The humidity barely shifts. The clay is protected because the words matter, because someone long after the original composition copied them again, and someone after that copied them again. Scribes did not preserve these tablets casually. They preserved them because they considered them records of something worth remembering. And the records point again and again to beings the texts call the Anunnaki. Modern scholarship usually translates the term in broad mythological terms, treating the Anunnaki as a class of deities. Yet the tablets themselves often describe something more structured than the modern word gods comfortably conveys. The Weld-Blundell prism, known as WB444, opens its chronology not with an origin myth in the abstract, but with a transfer of authority. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, descended, installed, brought from elsewhere, not evolved gradually, not discovered, not invented by human trial and error, descended. That verb matters, and perhaps it matters more than we first allow. Because once kingship descends, it has to be administered. It has to be held, distributed, enforced, recorded. And the king list, like the flood tablets, divides time into before and after. Before the flood, after the flood. A break so decisive that chronology itself bends around it. Before the flood rulers reign for spans so long they seem impossible. After the flood, the numbers contract first to what still feels immense, then finally to human scale. This pattern can be read as myth, and often is. But the text itself presents it as transition, not fantasy, a change in administration, a change in conditions, a change in who ruled, how long they ruled, and perhaps what kind of world they ruled over. Across the tablets, the Anunnaki do not appear only as distant objects of worship. They appear as office holders. Enlil governs. Enki administers water and wisdom. Anu presides. In the descent of Inanna, the Anunna sit as judges. They hear, they deliberate, they condemn. The language is legal, formal, procedural. The atmosphere is not that of mystical ecstasy. It is the atmosphere of a court. And this quality repeats. It repeats often enough that we should hesitate before dismissing it as literary ornament. In the Atrahasis account, the lesser gods revolt because labor has become too burdensome. They dig canals, maintain courses, sustain the infrastructure, and then they refuse. An assembly meets. A solution is proposed. Humanity is created to assume the work. Even the act of creation is narrated not as ecstatic miracle, but as practical remedy. Clay is mixed. Divine essence is introduced. A process is described. A result is achieved. 7 males, 7 females, workers assigned to function. Canals, irrigation, offerings, maintenance. The language is procedural because the problem is procedural. Labor had to be transferred, burden had to be redistributed, an operation had to continue. And perhaps that is the real beginning of the whole sequence. Not the flood, not even the complaint. The beginning is administration, a system, a hierarchy, a managed world. The Anunnaki, as the tablets present them, are not abstract symbols floating above history. They are managers of a world that requires continuous maintenance. They allocate work. They receive support. They respond to breakdown. Then the question returns. If humanity was created to sustain the system, how did humanity become the system's problem? How does a worker population become a disturbance? At what point does utility become liability? At what point does maintenance become noise? The Eridu Genesis, preserved in CBS 10673, bridges that transition only partially. The tablet describes the founding of cities. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurapak. Cities emerge, population grows, infrastructure expands. At first, the growth seems purposeful, even approved. Human beings are doing what they were made to do. The world is being maintained. Then the tablet breaks, a damaged gap, a silence in clay. And after that silence, the narrative resumes on the edge of catastrophe. What happened in the missing section? What crossed the line? Was it one act, one threshold, one accumulated failure? Or was it simply that growth allowed to continue? Long enough became indistinguishable from disorder, the tablets do not fully say. They circle the answer. They name symptoms. They preserve decisions. But the missing transition remains like a dark corridor between 2 lit rooms. And perhaps that is why the opening complaint feels so cold. Because it arrives after a missing silence. Because the procedure begins only after the threshold has already been crossed. Because by the time the complaint is filed, the world is already in violation. The question is not only whether the Anunnaki were real, the question is what the Sumerians thought they were preserving when they copied these accounts again and again. why they wrote of assemblies, jurisdictions, escalating interventions, and administrative decisions as though these things had actually happened. Why they kept the record, why they protected it, why they did not let it disappear. The complaint was filed in clay. The world, according to the tablets, had become too loud, and before we can understand the punishment, we have to understand the complaint. Before we can understand the flood, we have to understand the structure that came before it, because the flood, if the tablets are to be read on their own terms, was not the first response. It was the last. And that is where we go next. Part 2. The first thing the tablets ask us to understand is that humanity in these accounts does not begin as a mystery. It begins as a solution. The lesser gods, burdened by toil, rebel. They burn their tools. They surround Enlil's dwelling. They refuse the work that keeps the world functioning. The canals must still be maintained. The courses must still be kept. The infrastructure cannot simply be abandoned because those responsible for it have grown exhausted. So the assembly gathers. The problem is discussed. Options are weighed. And Enki proposes what the texts present not as a miracle of love, but as a practical answer to labor shortage. Create a worker being. Transfer the burden. Keep the system running. Even here at the supposed beginning of human life, the atmosphere remains administrative. Clay is taken. A god possessing intelligence is sacrificed. Blood and earth are mixed. Human beings are formed in batches. The records move through the process with a tone that feels less like reverence than implementation. Men, women, assignment, deployment, work. And once more we feel the same pattern. Not whim, not spontaneous divinity, procedure. This is important because it changes the emotional center of the story. If humanity was created as part of an institutional solution, then later conflict between humanity and the Anunnaki is not framed first as sin against a creator. It is framed as dysfunction within a system that had a purpose that depended on balance, a balance that did not hold. The early cities in the tablets seem for a time to fulfill the intended design. Eridu Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurapak. Places are established. Populations increase. Fields are tended. Canals are kept. Offerings sustain the temples. Human civilization expands within the structure that made it. There is at least briefly a sense that the arrangement works, but it does not keep working. The Atrahasis chronology gives us the broad shape of the transition. About 1,200 years pass. Humanity multiplies. The land fills. Settlements swell. Activity intensifies. The world that had once been sparse and manageable becomes dense, crowded, restless, full of motion. And then the complaint surfaces in explicit form. The land was bellowing like a bull. Humanity's uproar had become too intense. Enlil could not sleep. That line must be allowed to linger because later readers have often tried to move away from it too quickly. Surely they say noise cannot really mean noise. Surely the term must be symbolic. Surely some moral or spiritual corruption hides behind the translation. Yet the tablets are stubborn. They say what they say. They give no sermon about wickedness. They do not list commandments broken. They do not frame the issue as ethical decay. They name disturbance. uproar, tumult, a condition incompatible with rest. Rigmu, hubaru, words that can mean sound clamor, tumult disorder, disruptive outcry. Literal noise perhaps, but perhaps also something broader. A collective intensity that refuses quiet, a population so swollen and active that ordinary containment fails. And still, even when we widen the meaning, the complaint remains strangely physical. The problem is not abstract evil. It is the pressure of human presence itself. The first response is telling. If the problem were morality, one might expect instruction, reform, warning, law. But that is not what the tablets describe. The first intervention targets fertility. Nintu, who helped bring humanity into being, is now told to restrict births. Infant loss increases. Miscarriages occur. Some women do not conceive. Population growth is checked. This is not moral correction. It is demographic management. And it works, but only for a while. That is the rhythm the tablets insist on, and we should not rush past it. A measure is imposed. The problem eases. Time passes. Recovery begins. Population rises again. The same disturbance returns. The system bends back toward crisis. Then the second intervention comes. Disease. The tablet names epidemic. Bodies lie unburied. Mortality rises sharply. Again the noise diminishes. Again the world grows quieter. Again, for a time it seems the problem may have been contained. But disease passes. Survivors remain. Birth resumes. Cities refill. Then comes drought. Not a season of poor harvest, but a prolonged withholding. Rain does not fall. Crops fail. Storage collapses. Famine deepens. The descriptions turn brutal because the event is brutal. Hunger spreads until ordinary social life begins to tear. The city's empty. The infrastructure degrades. Silence arrives, but it is the silence of collapse. Yet even then the silence is temporary. Enki, as the text tells it, undermines the severity of the famine by making food from the waters available. Some survive. And because some survive, recovery begins again when conditions change. Fields are replanted, labor resumes, populations climb, the same pattern returns, the same question returns, the same complaint returns. What does that tell us? It tells us that the problem in the tablet's own logic was not individual guilt. Individuals can be punished. Behaviors can be corrected. But the interventions do not focus on individuals, and they do not attempt reform. They focus on numbers, density, volume, presence. The measures are not disciplinary in a moral sense. They are subtractive. That is why the repeated cycle matters so much. If a birth restriction fails, more severe measures follow. If plague fails, harsher measures follow. If drought fails, the logic of escalation hardens. The sequence is bureaucratic because the problem is treated bureaucratically. Each intervention is a policy. Each policy is evaluated by outcome. Each outcome is judged insufficient. The ladder is climbed rung by rung, and at each rung, the same conclusion returns, the source of the disturbance remains. The wording of the tablets gives the whole thing a terrifying calm. Not because the events are gentle, but because the language is not hysterical. It is procedural, and procedure can feel colder than fury. Fury burns fast. Procedure takes notes. Fury explodes. Procedure records that prior measures were implemented and found inadequate. And still another question rises. Could populations in those ancient cities really create the scale of disturbance the tablets suggest? A few thousand people, perhaps 20,000, in a major center. Could that truly deprive divine administrators of sleep? Or does noise cover something more than acoustic volume? The text does not resolve the ambiguity. It leaves us where it leaves us, between literal sound and broader disorder, between concrete complaint and missing technical explanation. What it does not leave ambiguous is the logic of the response. Too many humans, too much disturbance, too much persistence, too much recovery after every reduction. The city grows, the people multiply, the noise returns. And here another loop closes. Humanity was made to keep the system running. But the more fully humanity succeeded as population, the more fully humanity became incompatible with the system's tolerances. Too few humans and the canals fail. Too many humans and the complaint begins again. Too little population and offerings decline. Too much population and rest disappears. The arrangement contains contradiction from the beginning, though the contradiction becomes visible only later. The flood then does not emerge from nowhere. It is not the first answer. It is what appears only after lesser answers have been tried and judged insufficient. The tablets insist on that sequence. They insist on it because it matters. This was not in their telling impulsive rage. It was a final measure after repeated failure. The noise remained, the numbers returned, the city refilled, the structures resumed, the pressure built. The same problem stood once again where it had stood before. And so the assembly had to meet again. Part 3. When the assembly meets again, the atmosphere of the tablets changes without truly changing. It grows heavier, but it remains procedural. That is what makes these texts so hard to place comfortably in the category of myth alone. Again and again, they return to the same pattern: complaint, deliberation, measure, evaluation, failure, escalation. The world is not destroyed in one wave of offended divinity. It is reviewed, managed, reduced, reviewed again, and only then brought to the edge of eradication. Birth restriction failed. Plague failed. Famine failed. That sequence matters because it tells us the flood was not imagined as punishment without precedent. It was imagined as the end of an administrative ladder. The last available answer, after every lesser answer had proven temporary. And perhaps temporary is the key word. Each intervention worked, but only in the short term. Each one produced quiet, but could not hold quiet. Each one reduced population, but could not fix the condition that caused population to regrow. This is the cycle the tablets cannot stop circling. The problem comes back. It always comes back. It returns after relief. It returns after death. It returns after silence. It returns because the structure that created humanity also created the conditions for recurrence. This is where Enki's role becomes especially important. Across the sequence, Enki is not presented as denying that a problem exists. He does not say the population is harmless. He does not say the complaint is fabricated. What he does again and again is resist the extremity of the solution. He opposes reduction through destruction. He softens policy when he can. He makes survival possible when broader authority has decided severity is necessary. During famine, he provides fish. During the flood narrative that follows, he will do something far more consequential. But the pattern is already visible before the final decision is made. He is the one figure in the tablets who seems unable or unwilling to accept that created beings can simply be discarded once they become inconvenient. This difference is not incidental. It reveals that the Anunnaki in these records are not one mind. They are not a flat symbol called divinity. They argue, they dissent, they disagree about methods, perhaps even about ethics. The assembly is not theater, it is conflict. Modern interpreters often soften the noise into metaphor. They say humanity's clamor really means corruption. They say moral disorder hides inside the language of disturbance. They align the Mesopotamian flood with later traditions in which wickedness, not noise, justifies destruction. And yet the tablets remain stubborn here too. If the issue were moral failure, why are the remedies demographic? Why do the measures reduce numbers rather than reform conduct? Why does the final post-flood solution involve fertility control rather than ethical transformation? The internal logic of the text points repeatedly toward one thing: population itself, or the conditions population creates, is the problem. That does not make the complaint less strange. It makes it more strange, because if the problem is built into success itself, then no moral reform can solve it. A city doing exactly what cities do, growing, trading, producing, speaking, moving, remaining active day and night, would inevitably drift toward violation. Success becomes disturbance. Order becomes tumult. Growth becomes guilt. And if that is true, then the human beings in these accounts are trapped inside a design contradiction they did not choose. They were made to maintain the system, but if they thrive too visibly inside the system, they trigger interventions from the very authorities who created them. The tablets preserve the dread of that contradiction without fully naming it. By the time the final council gathers, the issue is no longer whether humanity can be corrected in part. The question is whether the source of recurrence must be removed entirely. Enlil's position hardens. Previous measures have been attempted. Previous measures have not lasted. The problem keeps returning because humans keep returning. The logic becomes merciless in its simplicity. If the source of noise cannot remain quiet, the source cannot remain. Here, the phrase from the text lands with particular force. Make all the peoples perish by flood. It is not framed as eruption. It is phrased like authorization, method named, objective stated, outcome anticipated. That wording deserves to be heard more than once. Not because repetition is ornamental, but because repetition is the rhythm of the tablet itself. The complaint was filed. Lesser measures were attempted. Lesser measures failed. Therefore, a more comprehensive action was proposed. That is how the story moves. The language of institutional response, not the language of divine tantrum. And still the ambiguity of noise remains. Was it literal? Was it the sound of swelling cities? Unrest, night, activity, human density beyond tolerable thresholds? Was it social disorder, protest, urban clamor, a civilizational intensity with no exact modern equivalent? The text does not give a technical appendix. It gives only the complaint and the record of what followed. But the record of what followed is unambiguous. It culminates in assembly, and assembly means voices. It means one position trying to prevail over another. It means the flood is controversial even before it happens. That too is essential. The final measure is not unanimously embraced in tranquil certainty. It is advanced, resisted, then advanced again. The assembly moves toward it because alternative measures have failed, not because all participants are equally at peace with it. This matters because it gives the catastrophe a political shape. The flood is not simply sent, it is debated into being. The burden of that phrase is difficult to overstate. Debated into being, authorized into being, voted or confirmed into being. The world is not merely overwhelmed by cosmic force. The world is overwhelmed after a council decides that continuing to tolerate humanity is less acceptable than ending it. And yet even here, even at this most severe point, the story does not become simple. Because the moment the final measure is accepted, another counter-movement begins. Enki cannot overturn the decision. That much the tablets make clear. But he can respond to it. He can exploit its edges. He can remain inside the structure while refusing its deepest outcome. Which brings us to a subtle but crucial distinction the texts seem to preserve. The assembly authorizes destruction of population and civilization. It does not, or not quite, produce a clean narrative of absolute extinction. Somewhere in the gap between official policy and actual outcome, survival becomes possible. Not by open rebellion, by subversion, by loophole, by warning, by knowledge. This is where the story begins to narrow toward one household, one wall, one man who will be told what is coming without being told directly. But before that intimate turn, we should remain one moment longer inside the wider frame. The flood was not the first attempt. It was the last attempt. It followed lesser measures that each worked only briefly. It was approved through assembly procedure. It was opposed by the very figure most closely associated with humanity's creation. And it was driven by a complaint the tablets preserve with chilling directness. The world of human beings had become intolerably loud. That is what the texts record, or that is what they insist on recording. The noise returned. The silence could not be kept. The population regrew. The problem stood once again before the authorities responsible for order. And after every lesser answer had failed, the coldest answer of all moved to the center of the room. The council was about to decide that the only permanent silence was the silence left after everything had drowned. Part 4, Tablet BM 78943, preserves the council in fragments. But the fragments are enough. The great gods who decree fate sit exchanging opinions. Anu is present. Enlil is present. Enki is present. Ninhursag is present. Others are gathered under the broader title of the great gods. The assembly is formal. It has structure. It has speakers. It has a presiding authority. And most of all, it has disagreement. Enlil presents the case for final action. The previous interventions did not hold. Humanity survived. Humanity multiplied again. The disturbance returned. The records make his argument almost painfully practical. He is not invoking mystery. He is stating that all previous policies failed to produce lasting compliance. The problem persists because the population persists. The solution, therefore, must address the population completely. Enki answers from another angle. The fragments suggest he objects not only emotionally, but logically. Why destroy everyone for what some have become? Why eradicate the laboring species that still maintains the very infrastructure on which the system depends? Why choose totality when proportionality remains possible? Even where the tablet is damaged, the surviving structure is clear enough. He resists collective annihilation. And yet resistance fails, or rather, it fails inside the chamber. This is one of the most unsettling features of the text. Dissent exists, argument exists, alternatives are voiced. But the machinery of assembly still proceeds toward authorization. Anu calls the decision. The command is not to be revoked. The word is not to be taken back. The flood is to come. There it is again, the cold vocabulary of formal conclusion. Not rage spinning out of control, but a decision sealed. When the command stands, what remains for the dissenter? Open rebellion would fracture the authority structure itself. The tablets do not present Enki as rebel in that sense. He does not denounce the assembly's right to decide. He does something subtler and perhaps more dangerous. He obeys the form and evades the substance. He goes to Shurupak. The warning does not come as public proclamation. There is no general siren sounding across the cities, no trumpet of fairness, no chance for the population to plead its case. One man is selected, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, Ziusudra, different names across different traditions, but one role, one chosen survivor, one intelligence deemed worth preserving. Enki does not speak to him directly, at least not according to the letter of the assembly's restriction. He speaks to a wall. Wall, listen to me. Read wall, pay attention. Tear down the house. Build a boat. Save life. This detail has often been read as poetic strangeness, but within the logic of the narrative, it serves a precise function. Enki is not openly defying the ruling. He is slipping through its language. He did not warn a human, one could say. He spoke to a wall. The wall happened to be attached to a man capable of hearing. It is an act of procedural subversion, and the whole text seems aware of that. Enki remains who he has been through every earlier intervention, the figure who works within the system, but refuses to surrender everything the system demands. Then the instructions begin, and here again, the tablets become surprisingly exact. Build a boat, make it roofed over, seal it with bitumen, inside and out. Give it equal dimensions, divide it in levels, lay out the compartments in a specific pattern. These are not the vague commands of legend drifting through dream. They resemble technical directions. Even if the measurements vary slightly between Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, the shared atmosphere is the same. Construction must be specific, because survival depends on specification. Atrahasis asks what he should tell the people when they see the vessel rising. Enki supplies the cover story. Say the god has turned against me. Say I cannot remain here. Say departure will bring favor upon those who stay. Again, the detail matters because it exposes the human side of the event. Boat building does not happen in secret abstraction. It happens in a city, in sight of neighbors, amid explanation and concealment. The project requires social management as well as engineering, and the concealment is devastating. Those helping with the construction do not necessarily know they are assisting the instrument of their own exclusion. The city is still there. The routines still stand. perhaps ordinary life continues up to the edge of ruin. That is often how catastrophe works. People keep carrying materials, keep asking practical questions, keep believing the structure around them will outlast the day. The passenger list reveals what Enki intends to preserve: family, animals, stores of food and water, seeds, skilled workers, craftsmen, not random humanity, not moral abstraction, knowledge, capacity, reproductive continuity, the essentials of a restart. This is one of the places where the story becomes clearer by becoming colder. The chosen are not simply the pure, they are the necessary, the exceedingly wise man, his household, the carriers of skill, the stock from which life can resume. What survives is not innocence in the sentimental sense, but utility combined with trust. The future is curated, and still the deeper tension remains. If the flood is meant to eliminate the noise, why preserve those who can rebuild the same kind of world? Why keep the capacity that generated the problem? The tablets do not evade the question. They answer it only later through the post-flood protocols. Survival is permitted, but under new limits. Human life will continue, but not under the old open-ended demographic pattern. The flood destroys, the protocols constrain. One without the other would be incomplete, but that is later. For now, the mood narrows to preparation. The boat rises under borrowed explanation. The chosen supplies are gathered. The chosen beings are assembled. The city perhaps does not yet understand what kind of boundary it has approached, and that detail too should not be hurried past. The destruction of the world as these texts imagine it comes not with fair warning to all, but with private warning to one. Administrative authority decides. Administrative dissent subverts. The population as population is not consulted. That returns us to the same uncomfortable center. What kind of relationship is this between authorities and the beings under their care? Not worship in a purely devotional sense, not justice in any democratic sense. It is supervision, it is management, it is jurisdiction exercised from above with lives below arranged according to decisions made elsewhere. The flood is approaching, but before the waters come, a more intimate silence settles. The silence of sealed planning. The silence of knowing when others do not know. The silence of a man building survival while a city continues around him. And perhaps that is the most haunting moment of all. Not yet the storm, not yet the drowning, but the interval just before. The interval in which one household prepares for the end of everything, while ordinary life still speaks in the streets. The command has been issued. The warning has been delivered. The vessel is almost ready. The final measure debated and authorized in formal assembly is about to move from policy into weather. And once that shift happens, once the ruling becomes rain and roar and rising water, the tablets stop sounding like minutes from a council chamber and begin to sound like witness. Part 5. When the flood begins, the language changes. The administrative calm does not disappear entirely, but it gives way to immediacy. Procedure yields to sensation. Decision becomes event. Authorization becomes impact. What had been debated at a distance now falls with force on bodies, cities, roofs, fields, temples, walls. In the Atrahasis account, the appointed time arrives. A dad roars in the clouds. Atrahasis hears the signal and seals the door with bitumen. That image deserves to remain in the mind, the final sealing of the threshold. The world outside still present, still audible, but now separated by a layer of hardened black substance meant to hold against catastrophe. A last human action before the event exceeds human scale. Then the storm breaks. The text piles force upon force. Wind, deluge, tempest. The flood goes against the people like warfare. Brother cannot see brother. Humanity cannot be recognized from the sky. In the Eridu Genesis, the storm winds attack as one, a phrase that sounds coordinated rather than accidental. In Gilgamesh 6 days and 7 nights, the storm overwhelms the land. It is not merely weather in the modern neutral sense. It is operation. It is assault. It is total environment turned against settlement. And then comes the line that has unsettled readers for generations. The gods themselves became frightened of the deluge. They withdrew. They cowered like dogs against the outer wall of heaven. If the flood were only mythic display of effortless divine sovereignty, why preserve that detail? Why show the authorities disturbed by the force of what they had authorized? Why let the text record that even those associated with the destruction experienced fear when destruction arrived in full? This is one of the moments where the tablets refuse simplification. The flood is not glorified cleanly. It is not rendered as triumphant righteousness. It is terrible, and the text permits that terror to touch not only the drowned, but the overseers. Inside the boat, the experience becomes narrower and somehow more vast. The vessel rides sealed darkness. The outside world is erased into motion and noise. Utnapishtim later says, he opened a window only after the storm had ended and light fell on his face. Before that, there is enclosure, uncertainty, suspended survival. The chosen remnant is alive, but life has become waiting inside bitumen and timber while the old world vanishes. And outside, all the categories that structure civilization dissolve. Streets, houses, temples, fields, boundaries between neighbors, distinctions of status, accumulated wealth, the small habits of ordinary time, all are drawn under one level surface. Humanity, the text says, had turned to clay. That phrase does more than describe corpses. It returns the species to its beginning. Form collapses back into material. What had once been shaped from earth into laboring life becomes earth again. The flood is not only killing, it is reversal, creation undone into substance. When the waters finally calm, Utnapishtim looks out in every direction and sees only sea. Later, an island or mountain peak appears. Mount Namush holds the boat fast. The sequence that follows is familiar, but its familiarity should not flatten its force. Birds are sent. A dove returns. A swallow returns. A raven does not. The world is being tested for habitability in stages, not by revelation from above, but by observation, trial, interval return. Even here, the narrative remains oddly practical. Then comes emergence. The survivor leaves the vessel. An offering is prepared. Libations are poured. 7 and 7 vessels are set out. Cane, cedar, myrtle. Smoke rises, and then perhaps the most revealing image of all the gods gather over the offering like flies. Later readers have often recoiled from that line because it seems to demean the divine. But in the logic of these texts, it also reveals dependence. The flood did not only eliminate the noisy population, it interrupted the entire reciprocal structure. Offerings ceased during the catastrophe. Temples no longer received. Administrations no longer fed. If the Anunnaki depended in any sense on what humanity maintained for them, then the flood severed their own support as well. Destruction solved the complaint, but it also created absence. Absence of offerings, absence of labor, absence of functioning cities. Silence, yes, but also a broken system. This is where the emotional fracture inside the Anunnaki becomes impossible to ignore. Ishtar cries out. She says she will never forget those days. She calls humanity my people. She condemns Enlil's decision as unreasonable. These are not small touches of literary color. They preserve institutional blame after implementation. The catastrophe has occurred, but consensus has not been restored. The assembly may have voted yet, the aftermath exposes enduring fracture. And when Enlil arrives and sees that a boat has survived, his first reaction is anger, not relief. All life should have perished. How did any man survive? His rage is directed toward the gods, because survival means the decision was undermined. Someone inside the authority structure acted against the intended totality of the measure. Enki answers with the same logic he had used before the flood, but now his logic carries proof. Collective destruction was excessive. Punish the transgressor, not all. Be patient, not absolute. His argument remarkably is not met with a second round of annihilation. It prevails, or it prevails enough. Enlil boards the boat. He brings the survivors out. He blesses them. He transforms them. Formerly Utnapishtim was a man. Now he and his wife shall be like the gods. They are moved away set at the mouth of the rivers outside ordinary human life. This outcome is deeply strange if read only as morality tale. The survivors are not returned to common life as models of righteousness. They are removed from it, elevated beyond it. Their survival is both accepted and contained. They cannot remain ordinary humans without exposing the failure of the decree, but they also cannot be destroyed without reopening the argument Enki has already won. So they become exceptions. Exceptional survivors for an exceptional catastrophe. And the catastrophe itself remains difficult to classify even on its own terms. It is thorough, but not absolute. It is authorized, but regretted. It is implemented, but then morally and practically revised in its aftermath. It eliminates civilization, yet preserves the seed of another civilization. It produces silence, yet immediately reveals how much depended on what has been silenced. Perhaps that is why the flood sections feel less like triumph than aftermath from the moment the waters begin to recede. Even while destruction is still fresh, the texts are already asking what has been lost beyond the intended objective. Not only lives, not only noise, a system, an economy, a reciprocal structure, a world of maintenance offerings, labor, and administration that can no longer continue in the same way. So the flood does not close the question, it intensifies it. What had to be destroyed? What was lost that did not need to be lost? What part of the catastrophe solved the problem? And what part exceeded necessity? The tablets do not leave those questions outside the story. They let them enter the mouths of the gods themselves. The storm ends. The birds are sent. the offering rises. The authorities gather hungry and divided over the first smoke of the new world. And from that smoke, from that recognition that destruction had gone too far or had cost too much, the next phase begins. Not the rebuilding of cities yet. First, the rewriting of the rules. Part 6. The flood ends, but the problem does not end with the flood. That is the point the tablets insist upon. If the flood had been perfect solution, there would be no need for institutional adjustment afterward. The waters would have solved the issue absolutely. The record could close with catastrophe and leave the future undefined. But that is not what happens. Instead, the texts move into an aftermath of policy. The same beings who authorize destruction now begin to establish permanent constraints meant to prevent the conditions that led to destruction in the first place. That shift matters enormously. Before the flood, the response to crisis had been reactive. Population rises, complaint emerges, intervention follows. The intervention fails. A harsher one follows. Another failure. Another escalation. The system lurches from symptom to symptom. After the flood, the approach changes. The authorities do not wait for a later generation to become too numerous and too loud before acting again. They alter the structure of human life itself. Nintu, or Ninhursag, the same birth goddess associated with humanity's creation, now becomes central to humanity's limitation. New categories are instituted. Some women will not bear children. Some children will be lost. Some lines will not continue. Human lifespan itself will be shortened. The details vary in emphasis across traditions, but the direction is consistent. Growth must now be constrained from within. This is not framed as moral education. It is framed as demographic regulation. And once more the logic is revealing. If the flood had been sent because humans were wicked in an ethical sense, the permanent solution should have been repentance law, purification reform. Instead, the texts describe biological and social restrictions designed to keep population below dangerous thresholds. The root problem, whatever else it included, is treated as one of quantity recurrence and pressure. The post-flood protocols are therefore not incidental epilogue. They are the true conclusion of the argument. The flood says reactive destruction was possible. The new protocols say reactive destruction was too costly to remain the primary tool. That is what the regret passages begin to make visible. Ishtar's grief, the collective weeping, Enlil's immediate shift when confronted with Enki's reasoning. These are not decorative emotions floating above the plot. They are signs that the event forced institutional learning. Something had gone wrong even in success. Yes, the noise was ended. Yes, the population was reduced. Yes, the old cities were swept away. But the cost had exposed the bluntness of the solution. Offering ceased. Labor disappeared. The reciprocal structure on which both human survival and divine administration depended had collapsed. If the problem before the flood was overabundance, the problem during and immediately after the flood was near absence. Both were unstable. That returns us to the contradiction embedded from the beginning. Too few humans and the world cannot be maintained. Too many humans and the world becomes intolerable to those governing it. The post-flood settlement is an attempt to find a narrow band between those two extremes. Not no humanity, not unconstrained humanity, managed humanity. The Sumerian king list echoes this shift in another way. before the flood rains are impossibly long. After the flood, they shorten gradually toward mortal scale. However, one interprets the list mythologically or administratively, the narrative effect is unmistakable. A change in the conditions of human existence has occurred. Time itself feels differently inhabited. Duration contracts. The species is no longer what it was before the waters. And the survivors, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, Ziusudra, stand outside the new rule precisely because they are exceptions. They are not ordinary post-flood humanity. They are carried beyond it, granted a status that makes them singular rather than exemplary. The future belongs not to their immortality, but to the constrained populations that will rebuild under altered terms. There is something deeply unsettling in that. The flood is not remembered only as destruction. It is remembered as pivot, as reset, as the point after which humanity continues, but under more carefully engineered limits. What does that imply about the Anunnaki, as the texts imagine them? It implies that they are not simply worshipped powers acting mysteriously. They are authorities capable of evaluating outcomes and changing protocols. They learn. Or at least the system they represent learns. Not morally purified, perhaps, but adjusted. The flood is treated as excessive enough that a more sustainable order becomes necessary afterward. And yet the tablets do not allow the aftermath to feel clean or healed. The grief remains. The criticism remains. The memory remains. Ishtar says she will never forget those days. The language is almost traumatic. Not instructive in the cool sense, but unforgettable in the wound it leaves. This too should be heard more than once. The event solves the complaint, but it does not erase the horror of the solution. The event produces new rules, but the rules do not retroactively soften the drowning. Institutional reform follows catastrophe, but reform is not innocence. It is acknowledgement that catastrophe cannot remain routine. Perhaps that is why the flood narratives and later city laments seem to vibrate with the same unresolved unease. Destruction can be authorized. That much the tablets make plain. But authorization does not free the authorizers from aftermath. They must still confront what was done, what was lost, and what must change if the same conditions are not to produce the same terrible answer again. This is where the story begins to widen beyond the flood itself. Because the flood is only one catastrophic intervention. The pattern of authorized destruction, sorrow afterward, and uneasy reordering appears elsewhere too, in the laments over cities and texts where patron deities cannot save their own populations, in records where divine authority appears both absolute and fractured. The flood is the largest version of a recurring logic. A population grows, prosperity expands, noise rises, offerings falter, arrogance appears, a threshold is crossed. The authorities deliberate, intervention follows. What the flood changes is not that logic, but the scale at which it will be applied thereafter. No more total reset of the species. Instead, tighter controls, local destructions, city-specific catastrophes, bounded responses to recurring instability. The flood becomes the lesson behind later restraint. But even that later restraint has its own darkness. Because once we accept the post-flood framework the tablets seem to present, we are forced to ask a harder question. Were the transgressions that triggered intervention truly avoidable? Or were they simply what human civilization always becomes when it flourishes? That question moves us from the flood into the broader pattern of accusation. noise, offerings, population density, prosperity turning into independence. The tablets name these things in fragments across genres, across centuries. They appear again and again not as random offenses, but as recurring forms of violation. The flood may have ended, but the deeper conflict between growing human civilization and the authority that sought to manage it did not. The waters receded, the protocols were imposed, the survivors were set apart, the species continued under new limits. And still beneath all of it, the same troubling possibility remained that the very qualities that allow civilization to thrive are the same qualities that eventually make it intolerable to the powers governing it. Part 7. When we step back from the flood and look across the wider body of destruction texts, a pattern begins to emerge with greater clarity. The transgressions are practical. That may be the most important sentence in this entire sequence, and it deserves to be repeated. The transgressions, as the tablets name them, are practical, not evil in the abstract, not philosophical rebellion, not metaphysical impurity. The complaints center on conditions that disrupt the functioning of the system: too much noise, inadequate offerings, excessive population, and the kind of prosperity that turns into pride or independence. Let us stay with each of these slowly. First, noise, rigmu, huburu, the clamor that keeps returning. In the Atrahasis account, it is the explicit trigger. In other destruction texts, related language appears around unrest, shouting in streets activity that does not cease. The problem may not be mere volume in the simplest sense. It may be continuous urban intensity, the sound of a population that has become too large, too active, too unceasing to permit the quiet the authorities require. That reading is not only literal, it is structural. A small settlement sleeps, a great city does not. A city large enough to sustain trade labor exchange and movement into the night creates a new condition: perpetual activity. If temple complexes or administrative centers existed within or beside such cities, then the city's success becomes the administrator's disturbance. And that is what makes the complaint so difficult to solve. You cannot have thriving urban civilization without urban intensity. The very sign that the system is producing abundance may also be the sign that it is becoming intolerable to those above it. Second, offerings. Again and again, the text suggests that the relationship between humans and the Anunnaki involved provisioning. Offerings were not decorative gestures alone. They were sustenance obligation and economic flow. Temple economies organized labor storage and agricultural surplus around the necessity of maintaining that flow. So when a city fails in offerings, something practical has broken. Either the population consumes too much of what should be reserved, or agriculture cannot support both the people and the temples, or prosperity has made the people less dependent, less compliant, less willing to direct their surplus upward. Whatever the cause, the result is the same. The reciprocal order weakens. And if the Anunnaki in these texts are read as administrative authorities rather than floating myths, then inadequate offerings mean something more than ritual neglect. They mean institutional starvation, loss of support, breakdown of the economy that linked human labor to divine authority. Third, population itself. This is perhaps the deepest and most persistent problem. Every major intervention in the flood cycle points toward numbers. Every permanent post-flood protocol points toward numbers. The issue is not simply what humans do, but how many humans there are while doing it. Above a certain threshold, cities become noisy resources, become strained, offerings become harder to maintain, and local independence grows stronger. Population is therefore not background, it is central. Civilization at scale becomes in these texts inherently unstable. Fourth, arrogance. The people become prosperous and forget their place. The city grows strong and no longer trembles before its patron. This language is more subjective than the others, but that does not make it less revealing. Prosperity always carries a psychological consequence. Those who survive long enough, build well enough, and accumulate enough eventually begin to imagine that they stand on their own. From the perspective of the authority above them, this is arrogance. From the perspective of the people below, it may simply be maturity or self-rule. But the tablets preserve the complaint in the language of authority. Humans were made to maintain, to support, to remain within bounds. Once they begin to act like independent centers of power, the relationship strains. Read together. These transgressions are not random sins. They are the natural consequences of successful civilization. A city grows, population swells, activity extends, surplus becomes contested, confidence rises, dependence weakens. The very process of flourishing produces the conditions later named as violation. And that is what makes the whole cycle so dark. If the transgressions were rare moral failures, they could be avoided. But if the transgressions are the ordinary byproducts of growth, then every successful civilization is moving toward them by its own success. Not accidentally, but structurally. Not because the people are uniquely depraved, but because expansion itself pushes them toward thresholds the system above them cannot tolerate. This turns the story away from morality tale and toward system conflict. Human beings are not merely punished for being bad. Human populations become dangerous by becoming fully themselves as populations. More numerous, more active, more capable, more self-sustaining, more confident, more difficult to govern quietly. That returns us to the flood with renewed unease. The flood was not simply an answer to a one-time outrage. It was an answer to a recurring condition, human success becoming administratively intolerable. Later destructions, whether of cities like Ur or others named in lament literature, seem to preserve this same rhythm in smaller form. A city prospers, a city reaches prominence. The city is then judged. The decision descends from assembly. Patron deities grieve. The city falls. Afterwards, there is lament memory and partial rebuilding. Again, procedure and sorrow. Again, authority and regret. The tablets do not pretend these transgressions were always matters of deliberate malice. That is another reason their tone feels so unusual. They do not rage against evil with clean certainty. They document thresholds and consequences. The city became too much. The people forgot their place. The provisions failed. The noise exceeded tolerance. Therefore, intervention followed. But that leaves us with an even more difficult question. If the transgressions were woven into the ordinary development of civilization, then were humans ever meant to succeed indefinitely? Or was the system designed to require periodic correction, because no thriving human world could remain forever within acceptable bounds? The post-flood protocols suggest the authorities themselves recognize this. Why else shorten lifespan? Why else institute barrenness? infant loss, and demographic limits. If unrestricted flourishing always leads back to crisis, then flourishing must be constrained at the level of biology and social order. That is the implication. The texts seem unwilling to hide. There is no perfect equilibrium. There is only management. Too much growth and the complaint returns. Too little growth and the infrastructure collapses. Too much prosperity and autonomy develops. Too much dependence and the system stagnates. The authorities seek a narrow band of acceptable humanity, productive, compliant, numerous enough to work, not numerous enough to overwhelm. The transgressions are therefore unforgivable in a peculiar sense. Not because they are the worst imaginable sins, but because they are the most predictable consequences of success. The authorities can forgive them temporarily. They can allow rebuilding. They can permit survival, but they cannot let them stand indefinitely, because to let them stand is to accept a form of human civilization that exceeds the design. And perhaps that is the deepest coldness in all these records. The people are destroyed not only for what they choose, but for what they become when conditions allow them to thrive. This is not a story of one forbidden act. It is a story of recurring thresholds. A civilization rises toward power, density, and noise. Authority above it determines that the rise has gone too far. Destruction becomes authorized correction. And still the same unease lingers after every intervention. Because even the tablets themselves seem to know that the condemned conditions are not monstrous aberrations. They are simply what city life becomes when it grows strong enough to stop whispering. Part 8. At the center of all these accounts sits a question the tablets never fully answer. By what right did the Anunnaki decide? That is not a theological question in the vague sense. It is an administrative question, a jurisdictional question, a question of authority. The tablets document that authority clearly enough in practice. Assemblies convene. Decisions are made. Commands are confirmed. Catastrophes follow. But the basis of the right itself remains strangely unsettled. Sometimes the texts imply that authority rests on priority. Kingship descended from heaven. Rule arrived from elsewhere and was installed. The Anunnaki stand at the beginning of organized control, not because humans elected them, but because they came first, with power, knowledge, and structure already in hand. At other times, the authority seems to rest on creation. Humanity was made by them, or at least under their direction, to assume burdens they no longer wish to carry. If creators establish the purpose of what they create, then perhaps the Anunnaki believed they held continuing rights over human populations as makers over made things. Yet neither foundation fully settles the matter. Priority gives power, but not necessarily legitimacy. Creation gives responsibility, but does it give unlimited permission to destroy? The tablets themselves seem uncertain, because the beings within them argue about exactly these things without naming them so directly. Enki's resistance matters here. He does not deny that the assembly exists. He does not claim the others are powerless, but he acts as though power alone is insufficient. He insists, in effect, that obligation modifies authority. If you created humanity, you cannot treat humanity as disposable. If some have transgressed, you cannot justly destroy all. If a solution solves one problem by producing a greater one, the decision should not stand unquestioned. The very existence of those objections suggests the right to decide was not absolute, even in the eyes of those inside the authority structure. The question was not whether decisions could be made. They clearly could. The question was whether they were justified. And if they were justified, by what standard? The assembly seems to function through procedure rather than revelation alone. Opinions are exchanged. Positions are argued. Commands are affirmed. That makes the Anunnaki look less like untouchable abstractions and more like an elite governing body with competing visions of policy. And governing bodies, even powerful ones, often confuse capacity with legitimacy. The tablets never quite clear them of that suspicion. Human populations, meanwhile, have no voice in the process. They are the object of decision, not the participants in it. Atrahasis is not consulted before the flood is authorized. Cities are not represented when their fates are discussed. The people may be central to the issue, but they are absent from the chamber. That silence matters. It turns every destruction narrative into a kind of vertical judgment. Authority above deliberates. Life below receives the outcome. The procedures may be formal, the reasoning may be debated, yet from the human side, it remains unilateral. This is one reason the texts are so difficult to read as simple legitimations of power. If their sole purpose were to glorify authority, why preserve so much internal dissent? Why show patron deities failing to save their own cities? Why record regret, reversal, and evident unease after implementation? Why let Ishtar condemn the flood as unreasonable? Why let Enki's critique stand? The tablets do not hide the fractures in authority. They display them. That does not make the Anunnaki harmless. On the contrary, it makes them more historically plausible within the logic of the records. Real authorities argue. Real institutions fracture internally. Real decisions carry dissent along with consequence. The assembly as the tablets imagine it is not serene perfection. It is power under tension. And perhaps that tension points to the truth the texts most nearly approach without declaring. The Anunnaki may have had authority in the practical sense, enough force, enough control, enough structure to impose outcomes. But the ethical legitimacy of that authority was never entirely settled, even among themselves. The flood reveals this most dramatically. Enlil champions total destruction. Enki objects, the measure is passed anyway. Then after implementation, the objections appear vindicated. Survivors remain. The policy shifts. Permanent protocols replace annihilation. The result is not simple confirmation of original right. It is revision born of consequence. Authority then is shown not as infallible sovereignty, but as something more compromised, powerful enough to act, fallible enough to regret, structured enough to enforce, uncertain enough to adapt afterward. This ambivalence reshapes the destruction narratives. If the Anunnaki possessed unquestionable moral right, then the flood and later city destructions would appear as harsh, but just system maintenance. If they lacked that right, then the same events look like catastrophic violence, imposed by an elite authority over dependent populations with no share in the decision. The tablets offer evidence for both readings and refuse to resolve the contradiction. They show humanity as created for service, which supports the authority claim. They also show humanity as bearing intelligence value and creator-linked obligation, which limits the authority claim. They show assemblies using formal procedure, which suggests legitimacy through order. They also show internal protests, grief, and rapid policy revision, which suggests the order itself could be wrong. perhaps that is why the question keeps returning. By what right did they decide? By arrival, by power, by creation, by necessity, by prior kingship, by simple possession of the means to enforce? Or were they, like many authorities in history, acting on a mixture of power and partial justification, convinced enough to proceed, uncertain enough to regret? The later decline of direct divine intervention in the texts complicates the question further. Over time, the Anunnaki seem to recede. Authority becomes more mediated, more distant, less openly administrative. Was this because their jurisdiction changed? Because conditions changed? Because human institutions absorbed what had once been exercised more directly from above? The tablets do not explain. They simply preserve the sense of a shift. That shift hints that whatever right the Anunnaki held was not eternal in form. It was historical, operative, and then transformed, which only deepens the uncertainty. If the authority could fade, then perhaps it was contingent all along. The records give us decisions, procedures, outcomes, and dissent. They do not give us a final answer about legitimacy. We are left with the catastrophe and the unresolved moral question surrounding it. And maybe that is not a flaw in the texts. Maybe it is the point. Maybe the scribes preserved the procedures and the disagreements because they knew that authority is never made innocent simply because it is organized. The assembly could decide. The world below had to endure the decision. The tablets record both realities. They do not ask us to forget either one. Part 9. Modern scholarship usually resolves this tension by moving the entire question into the category of myth. The Anunnaki on this reading are not historical administrators or real authorities in any concrete sense. They are personifications of natural forces, projections of political structures, symbolic beings through whom Mesopotamian societies explained flood, famine, plague, and conquest. The destruction narratives, therefore, are not records of what actually happened in the literal terms they present. They are theological and literary frameworks for understanding catastrophe. There is much in that approach that is reasonable. Ancient societies did explain disaster through divine action. Floods were real, droughts were real, epidemics were real, cities were destroyed, temples fell, and scribes living inside those experiences gave them narrative shape. From this perspective, assembly scenes' complaints about noise and divine debates are ways of making suffering intelligible. And yet something remains difficult to dismiss: the procedural density. Again and again, the texts go further into administrative detail than pure myth seems to require. The gods do not simply decide, they convene. They do not simply become angry, they debate measures. They do not simply punish, they escalate through policy steps and evaluate failure. After catastrophe, they do not merely vanish into symbolic distance. They revise protocols, establish demographic controls, and alter the terms under which humanity will continue. Mainstream interpretation answers this by saying that Mesopotamian scribes lived in bureaucratic societies so naturally their gods resemble bureaucrats. Palace and temple cultures organize the world through records, offices, rations, duties, decrees, and assemblies. Their myths therefore inherited the shape of their institutions. The divine realm looked administrative because administration was the dominant model of order in the human realm. That explanation is strong, but it does not answer every discomfort. Why, for example, preserve so much internal dissent if the goal is mainly to provide theological framing? Why let Enki's opposition be so consistent across texts? Why show Ishtar openly condemning the flood after it occurs? Why depict the gods themselves frightened by their own destruction? Why give the aftermath the texture not of triumphant justice, but of institutional regret? These things do not glorify divine authority. They complicate it. And the complication deepens when we look at the emphasis on knowledge preservation. In the Mesopotamian flood accounts, the chosen survivors bring not only family and animals, but skilled workers, craftsmen, and the practical contents of civilization. That detail is not impossible in myth, but it is unusually exact. The texts care about how rebuilding happens. They care about what kinds of knowledge must survive. They care about continuity, not only of bloodline, but of technical capacity. That is not where most mythology lingers. Myth often cares that life continues. These tablets care how life becomes functional again. The same is true of chronology. Numbers in myth can certainly be symbolic, exaggerated, or rhetorical. But the king lists and flood cycles present time in measured stages. 1,200 years, 7 years, 6 days and 7 nights, pre-flood and post-flood rains. The texts do not sound casual about sequence. They sound archival. This is one reason the documentary self-presentation of the tablets continues to trouble clean dismissal. The physical artifacts are real. The catalog numbers are real. The copying traditions are real. The scribal preservation is real. And the content inside them repeatedly presents itself as record rather than imaginative fable. Not modern record, of course. Not scientific report, but institutional memory. Here is where the mainstream response becomes most decisive. The fact that a text presents itself as record does not make it historical in the modern sense. Ancient cultures recorded myths as serious truth all the time. Physical preservation and archival care prove importance, not literal factuality. That is a fair caution, and it matters. Still, caution does not erase the strangeness. Because if the tablets are only myths in literary dress, then they are myths elaborated with an extraordinary amount of unnecessary administrative specificity. If they are only theology, then they are theology deeply interested in procedure, descent, logistics, demographic, policy, reconstruction, and the practical constraints of governance. If they are only symbolic, then they are symbols shaped with remarkable attention to the mechanics of institutional decision. Perhaps the simplest statement is this: the mainstream reading explains much, but not everything. It explains why floods become acts of gods. It explains why city destruction is narrated as divine judgment. It explains why ancient people framed calamity in sacred terms. But it struggles with the exactness of the bureaucratic texture. It struggles with how often the texts preserve details that undercut rather than strengthen divine grandeur. And it leaves open the possibility that the tablets may be preserving something more like remembered administrative history, translated into the only conceptual language available to the culture preserving it. That possibility does not require embracing fantasy. It does not require leaping into speculation about extraterrestrials or hidden machines. It requires only acknowledging that our categories, myth on one side, history on the other, may not fully capture what these texts are trying to be. They may be mythicized institutional memory, or historical memory expressed through theological vocabulary, or administrative recollection preserved in literary form. The point is not to force one answer where the evidence remains unsettled, The point is to notice that the tablets themselves resist neat modern sorting. And perhaps that resistance is why they endure in the imagination. Because they do not behave like simple tales. They behave like records whose own recordness has become difficult to interpret. They sound like proceedings, and yet what they describe exceeds what our ordinary sense of history can accept. They read like documentation of impossible events. So, modern scholarship dismisses the documentary claim and protects its categories. That move is understandable. It keeps method from collapsing into sensationalism. Yet it also means setting aside the text's own strongest gesture, their insistence on sequence procedure and preserved decision. What the mainstream dismisses, then, is not merely fringe speculation. It dismisses the possibility that the tablets mean themselves more literally than we allow, that they were intended as records of authorities, policies, catastrophes, and reforms, even if those records came wrapped in a cosmology that no longer fits our own. Whether that dismissal is correct remains an open question. But the question itself should not be buried too quickly. Because once we bury it, we no longer ask why the clay sounds so administrative, why the grief sounds so immediate, why the survivor lists sound so practical, why the institutional revisions after the flood sound less like mythic closure and more like lessons painfully learned. The mainstream protects rigor. It also leaves a residue of unease, a residue created by the texts themselves. And that residue is where Enki stands most sharply of all. Because if anyone in these accounts behaves less like symbol and more like a recurring political actor, it is Enki. Part 10. Across all these texts, Enki is the one figure who never stops complicating the system from within. He creates humanity or helps create it. He opposes the harshest anti-human measures. He supplies food during famine. He warns the flood survivor. He argues afterward that collective punishment is unjust. He accepts the structure of assembly, but repeatedly subverts the outcomes he believes go too far. This consistency is one of the most remarkable things about the tradition. It is not limited to a single story. It follows him from text to text, age to age, crisis to crisis. That consistency invites a deeper question. Why does Enki care as he does? The tablets suggest more than sentimental mercy. They suggest obligation. In texts like Enki and Ninmah, creation is not effortless perfection. It is trial variation problem solving. Imperfect beings appear. Forms do not work as intended on the first attempt. Enki's response to these imperfect creations is revealing. He assigns them roles. He finds place and purpose rather than discarding them. The attitude is not only cleverness, it is responsibility. What has been brought into being must not be abandoned casually. That principle helps explain everything that follows. If humanity contains a divine element mixed into clay, if intelligence itself is shared into the human form, then humans are not fully alien to their makers. They are derivative kin of a kind. To destroy them wholesale is not like clearing debris. It is like erasing a dependent order bound to its creators by design and substance. Enki appears to feel that bond in a way the others do not, or do not equally. The Atrahasis tradition hints at this when it preserves his opposition in the assembly. He had given the design, he had provided the model, he had participated in bringing these beings forth. That creates a responsibility he refuses to shed. He does not say humanity is blameless. He says again and again that the response must not exceed justice. There is another layer as well: knowledge. Enki is repeatedly associated with the Abzu, with wisdom, with the keeping of deep things. The texts portray him not simply as sympathetic, but informed. He knows the mechanics of survival. He knows where sustenance can be found during drought. He knows how a boat must be built to survive a flood. He knows how to thread language so that a warning can be given without openly violating an assembly's decree. He is not merely softer than Enlil. He is technically more resourceful. That matters because it turns his opposition into more than feeling. He resists from a position of understanding. Perhaps he knows that total destruction will cost more than those advocating it imagine. Perhaps he knows that humanity once removed entirely cannot be easily replaced without recreating the same burdens that produced humanity in the first place. Perhaps he knows that the problem is not existence as such, but density, and therefore thinks in terms of constraint rather than elimination. The tablets never fully spell out what he knows, but they repeatedly imply that he knows something. Something about consequence. Something about system fragility. Something about the obligations creation imposes on creator. This is especially clear in the flood episode. Enki cannot stop the decision in open council. That means the system above him still has force he cannot simply override, but he can work the edges. He can address a wall rather than a man. He can preserve a remnant rather than prevent the catastrophe. He can operate inside the shell of compliance while sabotaging the heart of the outcome. That is a very specific kind of resistance. It is not heroic revolt in the modern dramatic sense. It is procedural insurgency. It belongs to someone who knows institutions from the inside and understands that often the only way to resist them is through their ambiguities. Enki does not shatter the hierarchy. He exploits it. After the flood, that strategy is vindicated. The remnant survives. The catastrophe is exposed as excessive. The policy shifts toward permanent population management rather than repeated annihilation. In that sense, Enki wins not by preventing disaster, but by forcing the future to absorb his critique. The flood still happens, but the world after the flood is more Enki's world than Enlil's. Humanity continues. Survival is legitimized. Limits replace total erasure. And perhaps that is why the survivor is chosen not only for piety, but for wisdom. Atrahasis means exceedingly wise. Utnapishtim speaks as keeper of secrets. Ziusudra is linked with visions and understanding. The one preserved is not merely the most obedient. He is the one capable of receiving difficult knowledge, acting on it precisely, and carrying forward what must not be lost. Knowledge chooses knowledge. That may be the deepest pattern of Enki's role. He creates through knowledge. He preserves through knowledge. He resists through knowledge. He survives institutional violence, not by overpowering it, but by knowing where it is vulnerable to its own language and structure. This is one reason he remains so compelling, even within mainstream symbolic readings. As symbol, he is the figure of wisdom against severity. As narrative actor, he is the one who sees system logic more clearly than system itself. As administrative presence, he is the dissenter who understands that if you destroy everything noisy, you may also destroy everything that sustains you. In that sense, his opposition is not sentimental weakness. It is strategic realism joined to creator's responsibility. He sees that human populations are both burden and necessity, both problem and support, both too much and indispensable. He resists total solutions because he understands that total solutions rarely solve what they claim to solve. And if we ask again what the Sumerians thought they were preserving, Enki's consistency becomes central. They preserve not just catastrophe, but argument. Not just the decision to destroy, but the case against destruction. Not just the authority of assembly, but the voice that kept saying the assembly had gone too far. That voice matters because without it, the text would collapse into one-dimensional judgment. With it, they become something far stranger: records of power, arguing with itself over the acceptable limits of punishment. Enki knew something, perhaps many things. He knew how to build, how to preserve, how to warn, how to endure inside hierarchy without surrendering entirely to it. He knew perhaps most of all that once life is made, the maker remains bound to what has been made. And because he knew that the world did not end absolutely when the assembly ordered it to end, it ended enough to be remembered, enough to be lamented, enough to change the rules forever, but not enough to erase the species. That difference is Enki's signature in the story, and without that difference, there would be no one left to copy the tablets. Part 11. There is one more thing the tablets preserve, and they preserve it almost by accident. Silence. Not only the silence after destruction, but the silence inside the record itself. The damaged sections, the missing lines, the gaps where transition should be. The places where the clay simply stops speaking. In the Eridu Genesis, the movement from flourishing cities to authorized destruction is interrupted by physical loss. We are told the cities were founded. We are shown growth order development. Then comes a break in the tablet. And after that break, we find ourselves already near catastrophe. The missing middle may have contained the precise trigger, the accumulating pressures, the threshold event. But it is gone. The same is true elsewhere. Assembly debates are preserved in part and lost in part. The exact shape of dissent among the other Anunnaki beyond Enki is fragmentary. The practical definitions of noise remain unstated. The threshold at which acceptable population becomes intolerable population is never clearly enumerated. The human side of the catastrophe, the voices of those not chosen, the thoughts of those drowning, the reactions of those watching the boat rise in their city, barely enters the record at all. This silence matters because it shapes interpretation as much as the surviving lines do. We know the procedures better than we know the people subjected to them. We know the arguments of authority better than the experiences of the governed. We know the command to destroy more clearly than the ordinary life destroyed by it. That imbalance is not random. It reflects what institutions tend to preserve. Archives keep decrees, not screams. They keep minutes, not the scattered internal weather of the crowd. They keep formal reasoning, not the full human cost of policy. So when we read these tablets, we are reading from within the perspective of preservation itself. What survived was what power considered worth copying: the decision, the rationale, the authority structure, the exceptional survivor, the post-catastrophe revision. What did not survive or was never written at all includes most of what human populations themselves may have thought and felt. That does not make the documents false. It makes them partial. And perhaps that partiality is what gives them their eerie credibility. If they were pure literary invention, one might expect fuller dramatic access, more complete motives, cleaner symbolic meaning. Instead, we get something closer to institutional residue, enough to reconstruct procedure, not enough to restore total context. This is why the silence between lines can feel louder than the lines themselves. because it is there in the gaps that so many of the modern questions remain suspended. What exactly was Rigmu in operational terms? How large did a city have to become before intervention was considered? What technical mechanisms lay behind flood, famine, or plague in the minds of those preserving the text? Were the missing sections omitted by damage alone, or were some details never intended for broad archive in the first place? The association of Enki with the Abzu raises that possibility. If some knowledge remained restricted, then public or semi-public narrative tablets might preserve decision and consequence without revealing technical specifics. Administrative records often work like that. They show that something was done and by whose authority, while leaving specialized operational details elsewhere or nowhere recoverable. There is another silence too, one that may be even more haunting. The long stretches of ordinary time. The tablets tell us about crises, creation, revolt, complaint, intervention, flood, city destruction, protocol change. But what about the centuries in between? What about the periods when the system functioned without visible catastrophe? The ordinary generations who planted, repaired, offered, traded, married, birthed, and died under the arrangement. The record turns brightest at the moments of rupture. Stability leaves far less visible light. That creates a distortion in our reading. We encounter the Anunnaki primarily as destroyers or judges because that is what crisis documentation preserves. We see them at the edge of intervention, not during the quieter spans when order, however strained, continued. Our sense of their relation to humanity is therefore shaped by catastrophe. But the catastrophe itself implies long intervals of non-catastrophe. The flood is extraordinary because it is not constant. City destructions matter because cities were allowed to exist, grow, and function before being destroyed. Even in the harshest reading, the system was not perpetual annihilation. It was periodic intervention within long durations of managed life. The human majority of those durations remains mostly silent. We do not know how ordinary people understood the authorities above them. Fearfully, devotionally, pragmatically. With resentment, with dependence, with mixtures of all of these, the texts as we have them do not give much access. They give us the chosen survivor. They give us kings. They give us lamenting goddesses. They do not give us the baker, the canal worker, the mother in the street, the laborer hearing rumor of a rising boat. That silence should restrain our certainty. Perhaps it should also deepen our attention. Because if what survives is the administrative shell of catastrophic memory, then our task is not merely to force definitive answers from it. Our task is to hear how much remains unresolved inside what was preserved. The tablets tell us enough to know that a complaint was recorded, that responses escalated, that authority debated, that catastrophe occurred, that regret followed, and that new rules were imposed. They do not tell us enough to close the matter entirely. Maybe they were never meant to. Maybe part of what makes them endure is precisely that they are not complete. They preserve the shape of decision without fully restoring its world. They preserve the language of authority without resolving the ethics of authority. They preserve the outline of catastrophe without giving the full anatomy of what it felt like to those below it. The clay survives. The missing lines survive as missing. The silence survives as silence. And in that silence, the first question returns once more, perhaps more softly than before, perhaps more disturbingly. What were the Sumerians recording? A myth, a memory, a theology, an archive of impossible events, an institutional account whose categories no longer fit our own. The tablets do not settle that question. They simply keep waiting in their vaults, preserving what was spoken and what was not. Part 12. In the end, we return where we began, to the vault, the clay, and the complaint. A small, hardened tablet rests under controlled temperature and regulated air. A surface of earth carries words pressed into it almost 4,000 years ago. Those words survived empire war, neglect excavation, transport cataloging translation, skepticism, and fascination. They survived because people kept deciding they were worth preserving. And what they preserve is not certainty. They preserve a sequence. Humanity was created within a system of labor and oversight. Human populations grew, cities expanded, noise rose, offerings faltered, prosperity produced independence. Authorities debated how to respond, measures were attempted, birth limits, disease, drought, famine. Each measure quieted the world for a time. Each measure failed to quiet it permanently. The assembly met again. The flood was authorized. Enki resisted through knowledge and subversion. Survivors were preserved. The catastrophe ended the old world, but not the species. Regret followed. New rules were imposed. History or memory or mythic administration moved on. That is the pattern. And because it is a pattern, not a single burst of anger, the question remains alive in a different way. What made the Anunnaki angry enough to destroy civilizations? The tablets answer, but never in a way that lets the answer rest comfortably. Too much noise, too much population, too little offering, too much autonomy, too much human flourishing in forms that exceeded the tolerances of the system. But those answers are not final because they point back toward a larger tension. Human beings were apparently made for usefulness, yet punished when their usefulness became scale. Cities were allowed to grow, yet judged when growth became intensity. Prosperity was rewarded until it hardened into independence. The transgressions the tablets name are not always monstrous acts. Often they look like the ordinary consequences of success. That is why the records feel so modern in one unsettling sense. They are obsessed with thresholds, with what happens when populations become too dense, when systems become too strained, when authorities decide that management has failed and only drastic intervention remains. The language is ancient, the tension is not. Still, we should be careful. The tablets do not hand us a clean thesis, they hand us fragments. Administrative detail without technical completeness. Grief without full confession. Authority without unchallenged legitimacy. Documentation without total explanation. We can read them as mythology. We can read them as preserved institutional memory. We can read them as theology shaped by bureaucracy, or bureaucracy remembered through theology. None of those readings dissolves the mystery entirely. And perhaps it should not dissolve, because the unresolved quality of the material is part of its force. The damaged sections matter. The missing transitions matter. The silence around ordinary human lives matters. The fact that the gods themselves appear divided matters. The fact that the final solution became policy change rather than repeated extinction matters. The fact that even the destroyers seem troubled by what they destroyed matters. The tablets endure because they do not close the wound they open. They leave us with the image of a complaint fixed in clay, a grievance that sounds absurd, if heard too quickly, and terrifying if heard slowly. The noise of mankind has become too intense. Sleep cannot be achieved. A sentence like that can be dismissed as myth, or taken as metaphor, or treated as institutional memory, translated through an ancient vocabulary. But once heard, it is difficult to entirely forget. Because behind the complaint sits the larger possibility the tablets keep circling, without fully explaining that human civilization, left to flourish on its own momentum, may always produce forms of pressure that power eventually seeks to reduce. The names change, the cosmology changes, the authorities change. But the pattern growth complaint intervention revision remains familiar enough to unsettle us. If you listened all the way here, then perhaps you can feel the pace of the record itself. Not rushing, returning, asking the same question from different angles because the question does not open easily. What were the Sumerians recording? Why did they preserve destruction in the language of administration? Why did they let dissent remain in the archive? Why did they keep the regret along with the decree? There may never be a final answer strong enough to silence those questions, and maybe the silence is part of the inheritance. In the museum vaults, the tablets remain where they have been placed. Their humidity is regulated. Their surfaces are protected. Their words continue to wait. Not because they resolve everything, but because they do not. Because they preserve a world in which catastrophe was argued, authorized, lamented, and remembered. Because they hold both the command and the unease that followed the command. Because they carry in clay the shape of a problem and the shape of a response while withholding just enough to keep the mind returning. If this exploration stayed with you, a quiet note about where you listened from would be welcome, though nothing more is required. Some questions are meant less to be solved than to be carried. The vault stays cool. The clay endures. The lines remain cut into earth. Between those lines, the silences remain as well. The missing words, the absent voices, the unresolved authority, the unanswered technicalities, the grief after procedure, the humanity below the record of the humanity. Let all of that settle. Let the complaint remain what it was in the tablet, not a shout, but an entry. Not a scream, but a formal statement that something had crossed a threshold. And let the answer remain what the tablets made it, not pure wrath, but organized escalation, ending in waters vast enough to erase a world and still not erase the questions that world left behind. The Anunnaki, whether gods, administrators, symbols, or something modern categories cannot comfortably hold, are still there in the clay as presences inside a preserved argument. Enlil insisting, Enki resisting, Ishtar grieving, Anu confirming, humanity multiplying, the cities growing, the noise rising, the measures failing, the flood coming, the survivors emerging, the rules changing, the memory enduring, and beyond all of them, the silence. Rest there for a moment. The tablets are still in their vaults. The words are still in the clay. The questions are still open. And the mystery perhaps is not asking to be mastered, only remembered.